Mom, I think we should skip Thanksgiving this year, I said, my thumb hovering over the end call button, already anticipating her reaction. Rebecca and Wilson, don't you dare. Your father and I haven't seen the kids in months. Haven't seen my kids in months, but they'd seen my brother Jacob's children 3 weekends ago when they flew them to Disney World. All expenses paid. I stared at the faded crayon marks on my kitchen wall, evidence of children who were apparently less worthy of grandparental affection. Fine, I whispered, though everything inside me screamed to hang up. We'll be there. I'm not sure why I kept subjecting myself to these gatherings. Maybe some childish part of me still hoped they'd notice, really notice, my children. That they'd see how Ella excelled at science or how Nate's drawings captured emotion in ways that seemed impossible for a 9-year-old. Instead, they'd fawn over my brother's twins, Madison and Mason, whose private school tuition my parents paid without hesitation. The favoritism wasn't subtle. It was mathematical. Last Christmas, my parents spent $1,200 on each of Jacob's kids. My children received $50 gift cards to Target. When I mentioned it to my mother, she said, "Well, Jacob's children have certain expectations. Your kids are more down to earth." Down to earth. As if my deliberate choice to raise grounded, appreciative children instead of entitled ones was something to apologize for. My husband Mark squeezed my shoulder as I ended the call. We don't have to go. I know, but I also knew we would. Because despite everything, I wasn't ready to be the one who broke the family. Not yet. Thanksgiving unfolded exactly as expected. My father greeted Jacob's family with bear hugs and exclamations about how the twins had grown. My children received awkward pats on the head. My mother had prepared Madison's favorite pumpkin cheesecake, despite my reminder that Ella was allergic to dairy. I made a fruit salad for Ella, my mother said dismissively. The difference in treatment continued through dinner preparations. My mother hovered over Vanessa in the kitchen, asking if she needed anything, while ignoring my offers to help. My father took Jacob into his study to show him his newest golf clubs. I caught Ella watching this parade of preferences, her eyes following her cousins as they ran through the house, screeching with a freedom my children knew better than to test. "Nate, Ella," I said quietly, "why don't you show me what movies are on the streaming service in the den?" They nodded, understanding the rescue attempt. We retreated to the small room off the living room where my father's ancient recliner sat untouched by the twins' sticky fingers. "Are we leaving soon?" Ella whispered, leaning against me. "After dinner," I promised, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. At 11, she was already developing the emotional intelligence to recognize unfairness, but not yet the calluses to let it slide off her back. Nate crawled into my lap, though at 9, he was getting too big for it. Madison said Grandpa's taking them to New York for Christmas to see the big tree and stay in a fancy hotel. My heart clenched. We'd been planning to ask my parents if they wanted to join us for a simple Christmas at home this year. Mark's parents had passed years ago, and the kids deserved some grandparent magic in their lives. But apparently my parents already had plans that once again excluded us. "That sounds nice for them," I managed. Nate shrugged. "I don't care. Dad said maybe we could go see the light display at the botanical garden this year. That's better anyway." I hugged him tighter, grateful for Mark's consistent efforts to create special moments that didn't depend on my parents' approval. Dinner itself was an exercise in subtle humiliation. At the table, conversation revolved around the twins' achievements, Mason's soccer tournament, Madison's piano recital. My parents had attended both, of course, driving 3 hours each way, though they'd missed Nate's art show that was 15 minutes from their house. Jacob caught my eye across the table with a look that might have been apologetic, but did nothing to stop the spectacle. His wife Vanessa seemed oblivious, encouraging the twins to tell Grandpa about your new horse riding lessons. Horse riding lessons. Meanwhile, I'd had to start a second job to afford Ella's science camp. "Becca," my father announced during dessert, "Jacob has some exciting news." My brother straightened, slipping easily into the golden child role he'd perfected over 40 years. "We're building a new house in Falmouth Fourside. 6 bedrooms, pool, private beach access. That's wonderful, honey, my mother gushed. And we're happy to help with the down payment. I nearly choked on my coffee. They'd helped with their last house too, to the tune of $250,000. Meanwhile, when Mark and I needed a loan to fix our roof, my father had lectured us about financial responsibility. Actually, Jacob continued smoothly, we were hoping for a bit more than that. The property is significant. My father nodded without hesitation. Of course, whatever you need. I excused myself to the kitchen, hands shaking as I rinsed dishes with unnecessary force. Mark followed, leaning against the counter beside me. I can hear your teeth grinding from across the room, he murmured. Do you know what Ella asked me yesterday? I whispered. She asked if Grandma and Grandpa don't like her because she's not smart enough. Mark's jaw tightened. We should leave. Not yet, I said, staring through the doorway at my children, sitting quietly at the table while Madison showed off her new Apple Watch, a just-because gift from my parents. I need to say something first, but I didn't. Instead, I plastered on a smile and endured another 2 hours before loading my confused, hurt children into our 10-year-old SUV and driving home in silence. On the drive home, Ella stared out the window, unusually quiet even for her contemplative nature. Nate had fallen asleep, his head against the window, thumb unconsciously brushing against the second-hand art set we'd found at a local shop, his most prized possession. You okay back there, Elle? I asked, meeting her eyes in the rear-view mirror. She nodded slowly. Mom, why do the twins get so much stuff? Mark and I exchanged glances. We'd had versions of this conversation before, always trying to shield the children from the harsh truth while not dismissing their perceptions. Your grandparents express love differently with different people, I said carefully. It doesn't mean they love you less. Even to my own ears, the explanation sounded hollow. Ella's expression told me she wasn't buying it either. It's okay, she said after a moment. Mason doesn't even know what elements are in the periodic table, and he's a whole year older than me. A laugh escaped me despite everything. That's not what makes someone valuable, sweetie. I know, she said simply. That's what you and Dad always say. People aren't valuable because of what they have or what they know. They're valuable because they're people. Mark reached across the console and squeezed my hand. In that moment, despite the sting of the evening, I felt a surge of pride. My children might never receive the material advantages their cousins took for granted, but they were growing into humans with substance. The call came 3 months later, on a Tuesday evening while I was helping Nate with homework. Rebecca. My father's voice sounded strange, thin and hollow. I need to speak with you. What followed was a confession I never expected to hear. My father, the successful investment manager who'd always acted like he was one stock pick away from a yacht, had made a series of catastrophic financial decisions. Investments in high-risk ventures, leveraging their house, using retirement funds to cover margin calls. We've lost everything, he said flatly. The house, the investments, even the lake cabin. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table. How much is everything? All of it. We have about $20,000 left in cash, and after that, nothing. The magnitude of it struck me like a physical blow. My parents were in their 70s with no income, no assets, and apparently no backup plan. Have you told Jacob? I asked, already knowing the answer. We called him first, of course, my father said, and I closed my eyes against the familiar sting. Of course. He's considering options. Translation. Jacob had said no. Dad, what do you need? His voice cracked for the first time. A place to stay. Just until we figure things out. I should have said no. Every cell in my body wanted to, but the word that came out was, okay. When I hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the stack of science homework Nate and I had been working through. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father had always claimed financial expertise as his special gift, the reason he'd favored Jacob, who had followed him into investment banking. I'd chosen teaching, a profession my father called admirable but impractical. Now my impractical career was the stable one. Mark was less accommodating when I told him. They've ignored our children for a decade, and now they expect to move in? After they just offered to help Jacob buy a mansion? I know, I said, pressing my hands against my eyes. But what else can they do? They can ask their precious golden son for help, he said. They did. He said no. Mark's expression shifted. Of course he did. We explained the situation to the children as gently as possible. To my surprise, they took the news in stride. Where will they sleep? Nate asked practically. Can Grandpa still have his special chair? He always sits in the same spot. We'll make it work, I promised, though I wasn't sure how. Ella seemed more concerned about the emotional implications. Are they sad about losing their house? When Jessie's family had to move because her dad lost his job, she cried at school. I pulled her into a hug. Yes, they're sad. And probably embarrassed too. She nodded solemnly. We should be extra nice then. My children's compassion made my chest ache. They'd received so little from my parents, yet offered generosity without hesitation. I wish my parents could see what I saw, the wealth of character that had nothing to do with bank accounts. My parents arrived the following weekend with 4 suitcases and hollow eyes. I'd cleared out our home office, the room I used for my second job tutoring online, and set up a bed. It was small, nothing like their king-sized adjustable mattress, but it was the best we could do. It's temporary, my mother kept saying, though to reassure herself or me, I wasn't sure. The first few days were awkward. My parents seemed shell-shocked, moving through our modest house like tourists in a foreign country. They flinched at the noise of children laughing, and used to the everyday chaos of family life they'd always kept at arm's length. The twins are away at ski camp in Vermont, my mother mentioned on the 3rd day, staring at her phone. Jacob says it's good for them to stay focused on normal activities during this difficult time. I nearly laughed. This difficult time is happening to you, Mom, not to them. She looked up, surprised by my tone. My father spent most days on his phone, making calls that grew increasingly desperate as former colleagues stopped answering. I caught snippets. Pleas for consulting work, inquiries about liquidating remaining assets, conversations with an attorney about bankruptcy options. The real revelation came when my father asked about our internet speed. It seems sluggish compared to what we're used to. We have the basic package, I explained. It's what we can afford. His brow furrowed. But don't you need faster service for your work? I make do, I said simply. Later that night, I overheard my mother on the phone with Jacob. Just until you can help us get set up somewhere. Rebecca's place is so cramped, and the neighborhood isn't what we're used to. My hands curled into fists, but I walked away. This wasn't the time. Our routines adjusted around their presence. I took on more online tutoring to help with the increased grocery bills, working late after the children were in bed. Mark picked up weekend shifts at the hardware store where he occasionally helped out. We never mentioned these accommodations to my parents. The weeks dragged on. My parents called Jacob daily, but his responses grew increasingly terse. The twins were too busy with activities for visits. Vanessa thought it would be disruptive to have my parents stay with them. Meanwhile, my children showed extraordinary grace. Ella offered my mother her favorite stuffed animal when she seemed sad. Nate drew pictures to brighten Grandpa's wall. They made room, adjusted their routines, gave up privacy. All for grandparents who had never done the same for them. One evening, I found my father sitting on our back porch, staring into the darkness. I hesitated, then sat beside him. Jacob hung up on me tonight, he said without preamble. I asked if we could borrow against the money we gave him for his first house. He said it was a gift, not a loan. I said nothing. What was there to say? I always thought. He trailed off, then tried again. I always believed I was setting him up for success, teaching him how the world works. And what world is that, Dad? He looked at me, startled by the question. The real one, where you need connections, prestige, the right schools. And what about my world? I asked quietly. The one where we budget for groceries and fix things instead of replacing them? Where we save for months to afford a science camp? He had no answer. The breaking point came 6 weeks in. I returned from work to find my mother sobbing at our kitchen table, my father stone-faced beside her. What happened? I asked, immediately checking for signs of my children. Jacob called. My father said flatly. He and Vanessa feel it would be best if we didn't contact them for a while. Apparently, our situation is causing the twins anxiety. I sat down slowly. Did he offer any help at all? He suggested we look into government assistance. My mother whispered, fresh tears falling. His children, our grandchildren, don't want to see us like this. It's humiliating. Something cold and clarifying settled over me. But my children have to see you like this? They have to give up space and privacy and resources? That's acceptable. My parents stared at me, genuinely puzzled. My children, who you've ignored and dismissed for years, are the ones showing compassion. They're sharing their home, their toys, their parents' attention, while your precious golden grandchildren can't even be bothered to call. Rebecca, my father started.
No.
I stood up. You don't get to interrupt me.
Not now.
And finally, after years of biting my tongue, I laid it all out. The gifts, the missed events, the condescension, the way they'd pumped hundreds of thousands into Jacob's family while treating mine like an obligation. Do you know what the difference is? I asked, voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. I never taught my children that people are only valuable if they have money or status. I taught them that family means showing up, even when it's inconvenient, even when there's nothing to gain. My mother's tears had stopped. They both looked stunned, as if I'd been speaking a language they'd never heard before. You're welcome to stay here, I continued. We'll help you get back on your feet. Not because you deserve it, but because it's the right thing to do. And because I want my children to see what real family loyalty looks like. I left them sitting there and went to check on my kids. That night, I found Ella reading in her bed while past her usual lights-out time. Couldn't sleep? I asked, sitting on the edge of her mattress. She closed her book. I heard you yelling at Grandma and Grandpa. My heart sank. I'm sorry you had to hear that. I'm not, she said simply. They hurt your feelings. For a long time, I think. I brushed her hair back from her forehead. Adults are complicated, sweetie. Are they staying with us still? Yes. She nodded, satisfied. Good. They need help. And we help people who need it, even when they're not nice. I hug her then, overwhelmed by the wisdom in her young heart. When did you get so smart? Mom, she rolled her eyes. I've always been smart. Just ask my science teacher. The next 3 months were a masterclass in irony. I helped my father apply for Social Security benefits he'd delayed taking. Mark found him a part-time consulting position through a work connection. I helped my mother sell her designer clothes and jewelry on consignment, items that had cost more than my monthly salary but returned pennies on the dollar. Jacob called exactly twice. Once to say he was still figuring things out, and once to inform them he'd enrolled the twins in an even more exclusive private school to help them process all this change. Meanwhile, my children continued their quiet acts of kindness. Ella tutored my mother on using budget apps. Nate included my father in his weekend bike rides. They made room at the dinner table in movie night selections, in holiday traditions. My parents began to notice. I caught my father watching Nate drawing one afternoon, a look of genuine wonder on his face. He's remarkably talented, he said quietly. Has he always been? Yes, I answered simply. You just never looked. My mother started joining Ella's science experiments, her initial confusion giving way to fascination. She explains things so clearly, she told me one evening. She should be a teacher. Like her mother, my father added softly, and I felt something shift between us. I didn't point out that they'd missed years of these moments. There was no need. The realization was creeping into their consciousness on its own. By month 4, we'd found them a modest apartment they could afford on their newly structured finances. It was nothing like their previous home, a simple 1-bedroom in a senior complex across town, but it was clean, safe, and independent. The day before they moved out, my father asked to speak with me privately. We sat on the back porch, watching Nate and Ella play in the yard. I don't know how to apologize for something this big, he said finally. I'm not sure there are words. There aren't, I agreed. He nodded slowly. We failed you. And we failed them. He gestured toward my children. I keep thinking about all we've missed. All the moments we threw away because we were too blinded by, I don't even know what. Status? Some twisted idea of success. I didn't offer reassurance. This was his reckoning to face. Jacob hasn't taken our calls in 3 weeks, he continued. The twins haven't spoken to us once. Are you surprised? He shook his head.
No.
We taught them that relationships are transactional. That people only matter when they're useful. They learned that lesson very well. We sat in silence for a moment. I'd like a chance, he said finally. Not to make it up, I know that's impossible. But to be present now. To see them for who they are. If you'll allow it. I looked at my children, their faces bright with the simple joy of play. I'll think about it, I said. After he went inside, I remained on the porch, letting the weight of his request settle over me. Part of me, a large part, wanted to refuse. To finally cut the tie that had brought so much pain into my life and threatened to bring it to my children. They deserved protection from the favoritism that had shaped my childhood. But there was another part of me that recognized the opportunity for a different kind of justice. Not the vengeful kind that would leave my parents isolated in their old age, but the kind that would force them to see, day after day, the incredible children they'd overlooked. The kind that would remind them, with every interaction, of what they'd thrown away in pursuit of status. That evening, I discussed it with Mark after the kids were asleep. They don't deserve a relationship with our kids, he said flatly. I know, I agreed. But it's not about what they deserve. It's about what kind of people we want our children to become. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. So we just forgive and forget? No, I said firmly. We establish boundaries. We protect our kids from being hurt again. But we also show them that sometimes healing is possible when the person who caused harm takes responsibility and makes genuine changes. And if they don't change? If this is just temporary gratitude that fades once they're back on their feet? I shrugged. Then we walk away for good. But at least we'll know we gave them the chance they never gave us. My parents moved into their apartment the next day. We helped them settle in, arranged the furniture, stocked the refrigerator. My mother cried when Ella and Nate presented them with handmade, housewarming cards. As we prepared to leave, my mother pulled me aside. I understand now that we don't deserve a relationship with you or your children, she said, her eyes clear and direct for perhaps the first time in our adult relationship. But if you decide to give us that gift, we promise to treasure it. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I gathered my family and headed home. That night, after the kids were in bed, Mark and I talked for hours. About boundaries and second chances. About protecting our children while leaving room for growth. About what forgiveness does and doesn't require. In the morning, I made my decision. I called my parents and set clear terms. They could have a relationship with my children, but it would be on my terms. No lavish gifts to compensate for past neglect. No comparisons to their cousins. Regular, consistent presence at events both big and small. And if Jacob ever decides to reconcile? I asked. What then? My father's answer was simple. We'd welcome it. But we've learned our lesson about putting all our eggs in one basket. Some investments aren't about money at all. 6 months later, we celebrated Nate's 10th birthday. My parents arrived early to help set up, bringing a thoughtfully chosen art set within the budget we'd agreed upon. They sat in the front row during Ella's science fair the following week. Small steps, but consistent ones. My mother called one afternoon, her voice unusually hesitant. Rebecca, I was wondering, would it be all right if I volunteered at Ella's school? They're looking for help with the science program, and I thought... I paused, surprised by the request. I think she'd like that, Mom. Really? The hope in her voice was palpable. Yes, I said, realizing it was true. She would. My father found his own way to connect. He started taking Nate fishing on Saturday mornings, something he'd never done with Jacob or me. I watched them return from these expeditions, my father animated in a way I'd rarely seen, Nate proudly displaying whatever modest catch they'd managed. Jacob never did reconcile. According to mutual family friends, he and Vanessa had completed their dream house, but rarely hosted visitors. The twins continued their exclusive education, largely isolated from the financial reality their grandparents now lived. At Christmas, 6 months after my parents' move, we invited them to join us for our modest celebration. They arrived bearing gifts that showed real thought rather than expense: a beginner's microscope kit for Ella that my mother had found secondhand but cleaned to perfection, a set of professional drawing pencils for Nate that my father had researched extensively. "We have something for you too," my mother said, handing me a small envelope. Inside was a card containing a certificate for a weekend getaway for Mark and me. Nothing extravagant, but clearly the result of careful saving on their part. "We'll watch the kids," my father explained, "if that's okay with you." The trust implied in that offer wasn't lost on me. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. As for me, I kept my promise to help my parents rebuild their lives, but maintained firm boundaries. Some wounds were too deep for complete healing. Some trust could never be fully restored. But watching my father teach Nate to fix a bicycle chain, or seeing my mother actually listen to Ella explain her latest experiment, I found something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a quiet satisfaction in justice served through living well. The golden children had turned out to be fool's gold after all. And my ordinary, overlooked, magnificent children? They were the real treasure, solid through and through. One evening, as we finished a family dinner at our home, my parents, now regular Sunday guests, my mother reached for my hand across the table.
"Thank you," she said simply.
I nodded, accepting the gratitude without need for elaboration. We both knew what she meant. Later, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Mark found me on the porch swing, staring at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside me. "I was just thinking that I'm free now," I replied. For years, I kept hoping they'd see my children's worth. Kept trying to prove something. But I don't need that anymore. He squeezed my hand. "Your parents lost everything, but you've lost something too." "Yes," I agreed. "I lost the need for their approval. And that might be the most valuable thing I could have given up." We sat in comfortable silence, the porch swing creaking gently beneath us. Above, the stars continued their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama, but somehow comforting in their constancy. I had set boundaries, helped when it was right, and walked away from what no longer served me or my children. The golden children would continue their privileged lives, never knowing what they'd missed in their self-absorption. And we would continue ours, ordinary and authentic and ultimately more valuable than all the fool's gold in the world.